I still remember the first time I walked into that building clutching my crumpled resume and trying to pretend my skirt wasn't slipping sideways. My name is Harper Evans. I'm 27 years old, and at that moment, my life was a chaotic mess. Rent was overdue. My cat was sick, and I'd just spilled coffee all over the only decent copy of my resume. Most people would have turned around, but I had learned the hard way that turning back never solves anything. So I pushed open those tall glass doors, ready to face whatever humiliation was waiting for me. Inside, everything smelled of expensive leather and polished marble. Even the receptionist looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. I opened my mouth too fast, words tumbling out like a flood. Yes, I was late. Yes, the subway broke down. Yes, the building name confused me. And yes, I spilled coffee on the paper, but you could still read it. Her blank stare was the first reminder that this place wasn't built for women like me. It was built for people like Arthur Collins, cold, untouchable, and terrifyingly perfect. When I stepped into his office for the first time, my stomach knotted so hard I could barely breathe. Arthur sat behind a desk bigger than my whole kitchen table, his suit flawless, his eyes glacial. I had never seen a man look so composed, so in control, and so utterly unimpressed by my existence. He didn't even need to raise his voice, just one sentence. "You're late, and you've got lipstick on your tooth," and I already felt smaller than the heels I was wobbling in. I should have shrunk into myself like everyone else seemed to do around him. But something about his tone lit a fire in me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was exhaustion from a lifetime of being overlooked, but I refused to bow. Instead, I cracked a joke, forcing a smile, even though my insides were shaking. And for a second, a brief, impossible second, he looked at me, really looked at me as if he hadn't decided whether I was crazy or brave. That was the beginning of the disaster, and maybe deep down the beginning of something else. I didn't come from money. My mother is a nurse back in Ohio, working double shifts to keep us alive after my father disappeared from the picture. I dropped out of business school when the loans became unbearable, and I've been stumbling from one short-lived job to another ever since. People see clumsiness, stubbornness, and mistakes. They don't see the girl who stayed up late reading articles about laws she couldn't afford to study. They don't see the woman who memorized details because forgetting them meant losing opportunities. They don't see me. Not really. But Arthur did, though he'd never admit it. He saw me when I accidentally signed a confidential document that saved the company $15 million. He saw me when I picked up the phone and managed to calm their most important client, using nothing but scraps of knowledge I'd gathered from random news sites. And he saw me maybe most of all when I called him what he truly was, a robot in a suit, a man who had forgotten how to smile. No one dared talk to him like that, and maybe that's why he couldn't ignore me. But being noticed by Arthur Collins wasn't a blessing. It was a storm waiting to break. The whispers in the office began the moment I set foot there. "She'll last a week. 3 days tops." Every failure of mine fed their predictions, and every success of mine only made the rumors worse. They said I was reckless. They said I was lucky. And soon they started saying something much uglier, that the reason I was still standing was because Arthur wanted me for more than just my work. Those words cut deeper than I let anyone see. I had worked my entire life to prove I was more than the girl with the broken family and the unfinished degree. And just when I finally thought I had found a place to belong, they painted me as a fraud, as if my value could only be measured by a man's attention. And Arthur, he let them. The day the board confronted me, I thought he would defend me. I thought he would say what we both knew, that I had saved deals no one else could, that my ideas were keeping the company alive, that I mattered. Instead, he stayed silent. His silence was louder than any accusation. It told me that I was alone, that even the man who saw me clearer than most would rather let me drown than risk his perfect reputation. I walked out that day with my head held high, but inside I was shattered. Betrayal doesn't always come with knives or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence from the very person you thought might finally stand beside you. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Because leaving was not the end of my story with Arthur Collins. No, it was only the start of a tangled path filled with secrets, humiliation, and choices that would force both of us to face the darkest parts of ourselves. I thought I had escaped him. I thought walking away was the end. I was wrong. The first days after I quit felt like freedom wrapped in failure. I packed up my few belongings into a cardboard box, mismatched pens, a chipped mug, a notebook half filled with dreams, and walked out of that gleaming skyscraper with my chin high and my stomach hollow. I told myself it was my choice, that I wouldn't stay in a place that treated me like a stain on marble. But alone in my apartment, the silence pressed heavy against the walls. Bills piled up on the table, rent loomed at the end of the week, and the sting of betrayal cut deeper each time I replayed that moment. Arthur Collins sitting at the head of the boardroom, his lips sealed, his eyes cold while I was torn apart. I thought I would never see him again. But life doesn't untangle so neatly. A week later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Harper," the voice said, smooth and low, unmistakably his. "We need to talk." I almost hung up, almost. But something in his tone, sharp, urgent, maybe even regretful, stopped me. When we met, it wasn't in his glittering office, but at a small cafe tucked on a quiet street. He looked out of place there, his suit too sharp, his posture too rigid. For the first time, I noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way his fingers tapped against the table like a man haunted. "I owe you an explanation," he said. I laughed bitterly. "You owe me a hell of a lot more than that." He flinched just slightly but pressed on. "What happened in that room? I wasn't silent because I doubted you. I was silent because I was being blackmailed. Someone on the board has information about my family, information that, if exposed, could destroy everything I've built. If I defended you, it would have triggered them to use it. And I—" His voice cracked for the first time. I couldn't risk it. Not then. His words struck me like glass shattering. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him that choosing silence was no better than betrayal. But another part, the part that remembered the flicker of humanity in his gaze, wanted to know what secret could possibly make a man like Arthur Collins cower. "What kind of information?" I demanded. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "It's about my father, his death." It wasn't what it seemed. My blood ran cold. This was no longer about office politics or bruised pride. This was about buried truths and family shadows darker than I had imagined. That night, I lay awake, turning his words over and over. My anger hadn't vanished, but it was tangled now with something more dangerous: curiosity. If Arthur's silence had been born not of cruelty, but of fear, then what did that make me? A victim of his choices? Or a pawn in a war much bigger than us both? The next day, I found myself walking back into that skyscraper, not as an employee, but as an intruder into a life I swore I'd left behind. The whispers started immediately, snide comments, sideways glances, but I didn't care. I wasn't there to beg for a job or reclaim my pride. I was there to dig. In the archives room, buried under years of dust and forgotten contracts, I found the first thread. A letter yellowed at the edges, signed by Arthur's father weeks before his death. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blotched, but the words were clear. "They're coming for me. If anything happens, don't trust the board." My hands shook as I folded the paper back into the file. The board, the same people who had crucified me, who had silenced Arthur. My pulse hammered in my ears. Whatever killed his father wasn't an accident, and Arthur wasn't the only one they wanted to control. As I left the archives, the elevator doors opened, and there he was. Arthur, eyes wide when he saw the file clutched in my hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a mixture of warning and relief. "Neither should your father's secrets," I shot back. "So tell me, Arthur, are you ready to stop whispering?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time since I met him, I saw not the cold, perfect CEO, but a man standing at the edge of collapse. "Maybe," he said softly. "But if we do this, there's no turning back." And in that moment, I realized that whatever storm lay ahead, I was already inside it. He took me to a place I never expected: the Collins estate on the outskirts of the city. It was a sprawling mansion of stone and glass, the kind of home that whispered wealth in every corner. But walking through its halls, I felt none of the warmth a family house should hold. The walls were heavy with portraits of solemn faces, Ancestors glaring down with pride and disdain, and every room felt like it was waiting for someone to confess a sin. Arthur led me into his father's old study, a room sealed since his death. Dust layered the shelves, the curtains sagged with age, and the air smelled faintly of leather and stale smoke. He opened a drawer with shaking hands and pulled out a small box. Inside was a gold watch, its back engraved with initials and a date. But tucked beneath it was something far more disturbing, a stack of letters, each marked with the same name, Victor Hale. The name meant nothing to me, but Arthur's face hardened as if the letters burned. He was my father's closest friend, or so I thought. But these letters, he spread them out, his jaw tight. They're filled with threats, demands. If my father didn't hand over certain contracts, Victor would make sure he was remembered for his failures, not his legacy. The last letter is dated 2 days before his death. I scanned the words, my stomach twisting. Betrayal lived in every line, but what unsettled me most was a signature at the bottom of one page, not Victor's, but one of the board members. Proof that his father's enemies weren't outsiders. They were inside the very empire Arthur was now trying to control. I looked at him, at the sharp planes of his face that seemed to hold so much power, yet so much fear. Your father didn't die naturally, did he? Arthur's eyes met mine, raw and unguarded. No, he was silenced. And if I speak, if I expose this, they'll do the same to me. A chill ran through me. For the first time I saw why he hadn't defended me in that boardroom, not because he didn't care, but because he was suffocating under the same noose that once hung around his father's neck. Still, the anger inside me hadn't burned out. And what about me? Do you realize what your silence cost me? They humiliated me, painted me as nothing, and you just sat there. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment the invincible CEO looked like a broken boy. I know. And it's the one thing I can't forgive myself for. But if you're willing, I want you to help me finish what my father started. I can't do it alone. The storm in my chest twisted between rage and reluctant compassion. I should have walked away again. I should have left him to drown in his family's corruption. But then I thought of my own scars, of every time someone with power chose silence while I suffered. Maybe this was my chance to make sure no one else endured the same. Fine, I whispered, but if we do this, you don't get to be silent ever again. Not about me, not about the truth. Do you understand? He nodded, his gaze steady. I promise. That night, as I left the estate, the shadows of the portraits seemed to follow me, their painted eyes judging my every step. I knew the path I had chosen would drag me into a world of betrayal deeper than I'd ever imagined. And yet beneath the fear, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: purpose. Because this wasn't just Arthur's fight anymore. It was mine too. And I was done being the girl they whispered about. I was ready to be the woman who made them tremble. The weeks that followed felt like living in two worlds at once. By day, I returned to my small apartment where the fridge hummed too loudly and bills still cluttered the kitchen counter. By night, I found myself buried in files, contracts, and letters Arthur smuggled out of his father's study. We met in secret, sometimes at the old library no one used anymore, sometimes in the back corner of that same cafe where he had first confessed his silence. It was dangerous. Every document we uncovered was another nail pulled from the coffin Eleanor and the board had built around his father's death. But danger wasn't new to me. What was new was the strange partnership forming between Arthur and me. He wasn't the cold, untouchable man who once sat above me like a judge. He was restless, haunted, sometimes even human. I caught glimpses of the boy he must have been, before wealth hardened him, his hands running through his hair when the puzzle pieces wouldn't fit, the tremor in his voice when he read his father's handwriting aloud. And though I hated myself for it, I felt the old fire inside me, the same spark that had made me notice him in the first place. Still, every time that warmth crept in, I remembered the humiliation of that boardroom. I remembered standing alone while he kept silent, and I reminded myself trust is a luxury I can't afford. One night, Arthur slid a new folder across the cafe table. His jaw was tight, his voice low. This is what they've been hiding. I opened it, my breath catching. Bank statements, transfers, money funneled through shell companies disguised as consulting fees looping back into private accounts held by board members. And in the margins of one statement scribbled notes in Victor Hale's handwriting. But there was more. A photograph. My blood froze as I stared at it. It was Arthur's father seated at a dinner table beside Victor Hale and three current board members, smiling, laughing, and at the edge of the photo, blurred but unmistakable, Arthur's mother. I pushed the photo toward him. She knew. Arthur's face went pale, his fists clenching on the table. She swore to me she had nothing to do with it, that she was innocent. But if she was at that table... His voice broke. Then she betrayed him. She betrayed us. The weight of it crashed over both of us. His mother wasn't just complicit, she was part of the very circle that had strangled his father's legacy. And maybe worse, she had let her own son carry the silence while she lived untouched. I wanted to comfort him, but my own rage boiled too hot. "Do you understand now?" I said, my voice sharp. "This isn't just business, it's betrayal, and if you stay quiet again, you're no better than them." His eyes met mine, fierce and desperate. "Then help me. Don't let me fall into silence again." For a long moment, we just stared at each other, two broken souls tangled in secrets too heavy for either of us alone. And I realized this wasn't just his battle anymore. Every word, every file, every secret dragged me deeper into the web that had once crushed his father. If I walked away now, it would follow me for the rest of my life. So I whispered the only answer I could. "Then we burn it all down." His lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile but more like a vow, together. That night, walking home through the cold city air, I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on my back. The board, Victor Hale, even his mother, they wouldn't let us expose them without a fight. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the war ahead. I was afraid of what the truth might cost us both when it finally came into the light. The war began sooner than I expected. 2 days later, an article exploded across the business pages. CEO Collins under fire. Whispers of internal corruption. It didn't name sources, but I knew immediately where the leak came from. Someone on the board had sensed our digging. They wanted to strike first to frame Arthur as the villain before we could reveal the truth. By noon, paparazzi were circling the building, their cameras flashing like vultures. Employees whispered in corridors, eyes darting as if being caught speaking to me would put them in danger. When I walked through the lobby, a security guard muttered under his breath, "She's the one." She got too close. My chest tightened, but I didn't slow my steps. Let them whisper. I had done nothing wrong except refuse to stay silent. Arthur's office was chaos, phones ringing, assistants frantic, lawyers pacing. But at the center of it all, Arthur stood with the stillness of a man at war. When he saw me, his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. "They're moving faster than I thought," he said. "If we don't act now, the narrative will swallow us." I dropped the folder of evidence on his desk with a thud. Then we stopped whispering. That night we prepared our strike. We gathered every letter, every invoice, every photograph linking Victor Hale and the board to the siphoning of funds. And at the heart of it all, the dinner photo with his mother's blurred smile like a knife. Arthur hesitated over that one, his jaw clenched so hard I thought he'd break a tooth. "She's still my mother," he whispered. "She was your father's betrayer," I countered softly. "And if you let her keep her mask, you'll lose everything he died protecting." His silence cut me, but when he finally nodded, I knew the decision cost him more than he would ever admit. The next morning, Arthur called a press conference. The board tried to block him, but he invoked his rights as CEO. The room was packed with cameras, reporters, and shareholders hungry for blood. I stood at the edge of the stage, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the questions shouted across the crowd. Arthur stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady. "There have been accusations against me. But the truth is, the corruption you've heard about does exist. Not in me, but in the very people who sit on my board." He held up the documents, flashing them to the cameras. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He didn't stop. "These men and women betrayed this company, siphoned millions, and covered it up with lies. And my own family." His voice cracked, but he didn't falter. "Was part of it." I watched the crowd erupt, reporters scrambling, flashes, blinding chaos, swallowing the room. But all I could hear was his mother's voice in my head, cold and venomous, telling him once that silence was strength. And here he was, shattering it in front of the world. Later, when the building emptied and only silence remained, I found Arthur slumped in his chair, his tie undone, his hands trembling. He looked at me like a man who had just torn his own heart out. "It's done," he said hoarsely. "There's no going back." I walked closer, laying a hand on the pile of evidence between us. "Then let them come. We won't hide anymore." But as I said it, a chill ran through me, because I knew Eleanor Collins wasn't the kind of woman to fall quietly. She would strike back harder, sharper, and dirtier than anyone else. And when she did, she would aim not at Arthur, but at me. Her strike came with the precision of a blade. A week after the press conference, my face was plastered across tabloids Collins's mistress or corporate mole. They dragged my name through mud, painting me as the desperate cleaner turned climber who seduced her way into Arthur's world. They twisted every detail of my past, the debts, the jobs I'd lost, even my mother's illness, into proof that I was nothing more than a parasite. When I saw the headlines, bile rose in my throat. I wanted to crawl out of my own skin, but when Arthur stormed into my apartment with the papers crushed in his fist, I saw a different kind of fire in his eyes. "This is my mother," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "She thinks she can destroy you to break me, but she's wrong." I wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at me. "Arthur, people will believe her. They'll always believe her over me. I don't have your name. I don't have your power." He dropped the papers and knelt in front of me, his hands gripping mine. "You have the truth, and you have me. I won't stay silent this time, not about you, not about us." And he didn't. At the next shareholder meeting, when Eleanor tried to smear me again, Arthur stood before them all and spoke words that silenced the room. "This woman saved my company more times than my board ever has. She saved me from becoming the same silent coward my father was forced to be. If you want to drag her name, drag mine alongside it, because I stand with her." The board voted that day to remove Eleanor permanently, their decision sealed by the flood of evidence Arthur and I had unearthed. The woman who once ruled with pearls and poison was escorted out, her mask of elegance finally cracked beyond repair. But even in defeat, her glare cut like knives, a promise that her shadow would linger long after she was gone. When it was over, I stood outside the building, the same place I had first walked in, with a coffee-stained resume and trembling hands. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't voiceless. I had taken on an empire of silence and lived to tell the story. Arthur stood beside me, stripped of his old armor, his hand warm in mine. We didn't know what the future held, whether love or ruin, peace or more storms. But we knew one thing: we would no longer live in shadows. And as I looked out at the city, I thought of every person who had ever been silenced, every truth buried under fear, every voice dismissed as too small. If my story means anything, let it be this: you are never too small to burn down a lie. If my journey touched you, if you've ever carried wounds that silence tried to bury, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your story, because every voice deserves to be heard.